John, I'm told that if I am to believe in God, which I'd like to do, I have to believe in a perfect being. And then I get immersed in a storm of perfect being attributes, all powerful, all knowledgeable, all good, all free. How do I begin to think about perfect being theology?
Well, I think it's a basic intuition that you find, at least in our culture, and that we have to deal with, because most of us share it, that if there is a divine reality, then it is ultimate. And that is very easy to connect to the idea of perfection, that it must be perfect in some way in which we are not. But I would distinguish between two levels at which you can think about this. Perfect being theology, as the name suggests, has been developed to try to explicate, to try to understand the traditional theistic idea of a personal God. And that's why you mentioned the omni-attributes, omnipotence, right? All power. This is something that a person would hope to possess, perhaps, and God does, so it is said. Omniscience, all knowledge. Only a person knows things, and so on. So perfect being, perfect God, perfect personal God has to have these attributes. But what if the ultimate isn't a person at all? What if the ultimate is something else altogether? One of the sources of perfect being theology is the work of Anselm, the great philosophical theologian, who said of God that God is that than which none greater can be thought. And in that way, he was just articulating that intuition I mentioned before, that God is, whatever God is, God has to be that than which none greater can be thought. Now, Anselm himself was inclined to go further and say God has to be the person than which none greater can be thought, or maybe even the Trinitarian person than which none greater can be thought, because Anselm was a Christian. But the basic intuition he gives us, that than which none greater can be thought, doesn't refer to a person. It's that. The reality, whatever it is, than which none greater can be thought. And I don't think we have got there yet in our attempts to conceptualize the divine, the ultimate. So, perfect being, if you think that the divine has to be person, then sure, you're led in the direction of those omni-attributes. But you might sit loose from them if you think that the divine doesn't need to be a person.
Let's look at the two terms, ultimism, which you use, the ultimate reality, and perfection. It would seem that you have to have some sort of an ultimate, however limited or however broad, but that doesn't have to be perfect, as someone we would define it.
Well, the word perfect,
it has to be ultimate.
The word perfect tends to reflect our own, perhaps limited standards of value. And that's, I think, why some people, even some theologians, have been inclined to say, well, we shouldn't think of God as perfect. That reflects too much of us. But if you instead go with Anselm's basic idea, one way of putting it is a different way than his, is to say that God has to be, or the divine has to be, unsurpassably great. Is that any better than perfect? Unsurpassably great. Maybe that, or unlimitedly great. Or as I say when talking about
those are all different, slightly
ultimate.
Different nuances between unlimitedly great or unsurpassably great. You can be unsurpassably great, nothing can be more than you, but not be unlimited.
Well, I think that the unsurpassably great has to be unlimited because we can, mentally at least, surpass anything that is limited.
Okay, if you allow it from a conceptual basis as opposed to a reality basis, because there are two issues here, whether we want to think of it just conceptually, what we can imagine, or what really exists. Because what really exists really does exist. And it existed before there were ever human beings to imagine them.
Sure. Well, we started this conversation by talking about a concept, an idea, the idea of God, and God as perfect. I'd be inclined to say that thinking of God, even in the broadest sense, as perfect, might reflect our limitations. But if we use some of these other words to try to elicit what we're really after, we might get something that we want to stay with.
What would you use?
Axiological ultimacy. How's that?
Define what that
That's
means.
a mouthful.
Yeah.
Embodying the greatest possible value, and of course, the word embodying has to be taken as non-literally.
Representing, expressing,
containing in itself the greatest possible value. you see the religious impulse, the fundamental religious impulse in, for example, synagogues and mosques and churches when people worship God. All right? It wouldn't make sense to worship God if God were surpassably great, or if God weren't axiologically ultimate in value. All right? And so we need to think about what reality would be like if it included a reality that was not just metaphysically ultimate in the way that science itself might say something is, but also axiologically ultimate. And it may be that we want to let go of the word perfect because it's got too many human-centered connotations to it. But I don't think we're going to be able to let go of some related concept of the sort I've mentioned.
So at the end of the day, how do you describe your ultimate divine reality, which is not a personal theistic God?
Well, I think there are three kinds of ultimacy. I mean, this kind of talk about ultimacy is often derided as being, vague and contentless. And I do think that if you just say, well, there's some ultimate, that doesn't say a whole lot. But if you flesh it out a bit, as I would suggest, you get more content. You can say that it is ultimate in three different ways. Metaphysically, as was mentioned earlier, that means it provides the deepest explanation. It is, perhaps we could say, the deepest fact, the ultimate fact. But also axiologically, as we were saying. So not only metaphysically ultimate, but also axiologically.
Which means values.
Value, that's right. It embodies, as I was saying earlier, the deepest possible value. That goes way further than any naturalist would be inclined to go, right? And that's part of what allows us to see that we're talking about something religious here. I think that's what distinguishes religion from any naturalism. And thirdly, soteriological ultimacy, which just means ultimate good for us and for the species and for our world, can potentially be obtained in relation to this reality. You take those three things and you've got something I would call distinctively religious. And of course, something like the idea of perfection with which we began is in the middle of it.
But you're still a skeptic of whether it's real.
I'm a skeptic about it because I think there are various reasons for being skeptical about such very big and ambitious claims, religious and non-religious too.